My name is Romy Chandra Herbert. I was born and raised on the island of Fiji, and I call the traditional territory of the Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam people my home. I came to Canada when I was 9 years old, and when I was 9, it was a really challenging time because I was dependent on my family, and who I was as a gay person wasn't really talked about in any of the services that I went and accessed with my family. So that was a really challenging thing because even though we were receiving the support to settle here, I wasn't still receiving the support for myself to settle here personally. And after coming to Canada, I realized that my family couldn't afford to live in Vancouver, so we had to move out of Vancouver, where services were even limited. And so even further out in the suburbs, it was a tough time because I was dealing with my sexuality, but also my identity as a person of color, and not knowing which one was more important, or let alone which one who I was able to talk to about these issues. And when I realized who I was as a gay man, actually as a young gay teenager, there are a lot of stereotypes and assumptions that I was presented with. One of the things that I learned about being gay was that a lot of media representations of gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender people were a lot of white folks on TV, and during that time period, they were often talking about HIV/AIDS. And in my, like 12, 13-year-old kid's perspective, I was like, oh, hey, I'm one of those people too. But I translated those experiences on television to reality, and in my world, I made an assumption that all gay people had HIV/AIDS, and you got it the day that you came out to yourself. And it sounds silly, but those are the realities that I lived with, that I was HIV positive at 13 years old. And I did a lot of things during that time period to take care of myself in a holistic way, by taking a bus from the suburbs to Vancouver to access the AIDS Vancouver library to read books about how to take care of myself, because I didn't want to take up books from the library because I was afraid that my parents would find out what books I was reading. So I would go to AIDS Vancouver and read books on how to take care of myself, and only to realize that to come across a book that told me how people got HIV/AIDS, and I was like, oh, okay, I don't have HIV/AIDS, I'm just simply gay. And part of that was, I don't want to talk to anybody about this still because I'm still fearful of how this might come out. And in my friends, in my circle of friends, it was really challenging because I didn't know which one my racial identity or my sexuality was going to play out more or less with them in terms of how they saw me. Thankfully, most of them were supportive. Some of them, of course, weren't. And I decided, that this was the way that it was going to be in my school. And unfortunately, people would come to my high school looking for me to beat me up with baseball bats. They would show up at where I did volunteer work. And I just couldn't understand why there was this much hatred towards me from strangers who I had never met. But they knew who I was because the town I grew up in was really small, and my friends who were not accepting of who I was were quick to share that information with those who were not so supportive. So all of these experiences really, shaped my growing up in a small town. I remember, coming out to my parents and the challenges that I faced with them and some of the assumptions that they had. HIV/AIDS was one of them, that I was going to grow up and contract HIV/AIDS, and I think a lot of that stemmed from a lot of stereotypes in the media. Some of it also was around, assumption around could I even be gay, because in Fiji we didn't have anyone who was gay or lesbian, so maybe I am the only one for my country. And Part of that is because many folks in my country didn't come out because it was illegal to be gay or lesbian or bi or trans. So many people didn't come out. So there was this, assumption that it doesn't happen in our culture or in our families, when in fact it did, and it does. But it manifests itself in sometimes destructive ways, where we end up marrying people of the opposite sex and leading a life that is really not as fulfilling for anyone in that situation. I think that there are many ways that immigrants, refugees, when they face discrimination, the impact comes in many different ways. When we talk about LGBTQ populations, it's the feeling and the sense of not belonging to any group, whether it's your cultural community or even the LGBT community. Sometimes within the LGBT community, there is this fear that the homophobia that's emerging in Canadian society is stemming from immigrants and refugees who are coming from other countries, bringing their backwards views and allowing that to flourish in Canada, when we know that's not always the case. But oftentimes within the LGBT community, people end up using that as a tool to scapegoat immigrants and refugees and further marginalize them. And I think that is really harmful and hurtful. Many of my friends have encountered that kind of experience, whether it's in gay bars, to accessing, services, to relationship, finding people that they want to be in a relationship with. So it affects people in many different aspects of their lives. I think because there are so many unique things that immigrants and refugees who are gay and lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning their sexual identity or gender identities, they come with very different needs, and some of those needs are the basics from understanding some of those definitions, and not just us understanding those definitions, but many different groups of people who are in touch with these groups. Part of it is that their definitions and the ideas of what these words and expressions may come in different ways. So how do we know what one group is dealing with from another country is maybe different from another group? But it's really looking at what those needs are. Sometimes even the words, transgender may not even translate in certain languages. Sometimes we use terminologies like cisgender, and immigrants and refugees might be unsure what those words or terminologies mean, even though they might be experiencing those things. So I think sometimes, even within the LGBTQ immigrant refugee communities, we get so caught up in being progressive that we forget that there are communities that are still searching for their own identities, and they even get lost within that, the terminology world. Some of the specific services that I see immigrants and refugees needing require a lot more understanding of their own experiences. For example, immigrants and refugees may not necessarily come out and say that, this is the sexual identity or gender identity are issues that they're dealing with, because they're still in fear of even asking for that help. So in the end, many refugees and immigrants may end up not seeking the support that they need, or seeking it in ways that may be harmful to them. I think a lot of immigrants and refugees, when they experience some of these, hateful things in their lives, they may not know who to turn to. They may not know that there is support out there for them, or that they may even be confused that there are, they've dealt with so many more atrocious things back home. So dealing with this, incident of not being treated well in Canada, it might be just something that they just look over, and so they may not be dealing with it as effectively as they could be dealing with it, realizing that it might impact them in the long run when they're settling into Canada. LGBTQ populations often face the same kinds of barriers. Immigrant refugees face the same kinds of barriers that Canadians face: racism, classism, sexism, ableism, ageism, heterosexism. But I think sometimes they end up dealing with these issues in fear and in isolation, and unsure of where they belong when these experiences are presented to them.